The air in La Centilla was not merely air, it was a carefully curated atmosphere, a commodity as expensive as the vintage Barolo breathing in decanters on linen-draped tables. It smelled of old money, of leather-bound menus, of truffles shaved paper-thin over handmade pasta, and of a faint, floral perfume that seemed to cling to the velvet upholstery. Light did not simply illuminate the room. It dripped from crystal chandeliers like frozen constellations, catching the glint of platinum watches and the fire of diamond rings. Conversations were murmurs, a symphony of hushed power plays and discreet laughter, underscored by the gentle, rhythmic clinking of heavy silver against fine porcelain. Into this world of calculated opulence, Alara Vance moved like a ghost. Her presence was functional, not social. Dressed in a simple, immaculate black uniform, she was part of the background, a silent cog in the grand machine that catered to the city's elite. Her movements were economical and precise, honed by years of practice, whether she was refilling a water glass with a steady hand or clearing a table with such quiet efficiency that the diners barely registered her existence. She was invisible, and in this world invisibility was a survival trait. But behind Alara's placid professional mask, a different world existed, one of soaring buttresses, stress-bearing columns, and the intricate, hidden anatomy of the city itself. As her hands performed the menial, repetitive tasks of her job, her mind raced with schematics, blueprints, and the complex language of urban infrastructure. She possessed a gift, a near-eidetic memory for architectural design and city planning, a talent that had once promised her a brilliant future. She could mentally overlay the city's sewer systems, its forgotten subway tunnels, and its electrical grids onto the streets she walked every day. She saw the world not as a collection of buildings, but as a living organism of steel, concrete, and glass, each with its own history, its own weaknesses, its own secrets. This gift, which had once been her passion and her path to greatness, was now a silent, secret knowledge she carried within her, a constant, painful reminder of the life that had been stolen from her. It was a language no one around her spoke, a vision no one else could see, making her feel like a phantom architect haunting the ruins of her own dreams. The driving force behind her silent endurance, the reason she tolerated the condescending glances and the crushing anonymity, was the image of her father. She could still conjure the scent of sawdust and fresh-cut pine from his old workshop, the feel of his calloused, capable hands showing her how to read a blueprint when she was just a child. He had been a man built of integrity, an honest contractor whose small company was his life's work. That life had been shattered by a luxury condo development project, a glittering tower built on a foundation of lies. The primary developer had used substandard materials to line his own pockets, and when the structural failures became undeniable, he had masterfully framed the smaller contractors, her father chief among them. The financial ruin was swift and total, but the true devastation came in the form of a massive stroke that stole his voice, his mobility, and the light from his eyes. Alara had been forced to drop out of her master's program in architecture to become his full-time caregiver, the weight of his medical bills a constant, suffocating pressure. Every dollar she earned in this opulent restaurant went to the sterile, quiet room where he now lived, a silent testament to a crime that had gone unpunished. The delicate equilibrium of the restaurant shifted palpably with his arrival. It was not a loud entrance, but a change in the room's gravitational pull. Don Vincent Moretti, known to the city's elite as a real estate magnate and to the underworld as, quote, the architect, moved with an aura of absolute command. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than Alara made in 6 months, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, a heavy gold signet ring on his finger. The maitre d' practically bowed as he led Moretti and his entourage of grim-faced men to their private table. A hush fell over the nearby tables as he passed, a mixture of fear and reverence. Moretti acknowledged no one. His eyes, the color of cold slate, swept the room with a look of bored ownership. As he passed Alara, who was standing perfectly still by a service station, His gaze flickered over her for less than a second. It was not a look of recognition or even dismissal. It was a look of complete non-existence. To him, she was not a person, she was an object, a part of the scenery, as inanimate as the chair he was about to sit in. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of this city's gilded cage, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community for more tales where the overlooked rise to reclaim their power. This is a story you won't want to miss, a testament to the fact that the most formidable minds are often found in the most unexpected places, waiting for the precise moment to reveal themselves and alter the course of destiny forever. The clash between the unseen and the untouchable is about to begin, and the foundations of a corrupt empire are about to be shaken to their very core by a single, quiet voice that holds the power of truth. Later that night, long after the last diners had departed, leaving behind the ghosts of their expensive perfumes and the lingering scent of cigar smoke, Alara's duties took her to the restaurant's deepest sanctum, the private wine cellar. It was a subterranean vault of brick and dark, heavy wood, where bottles worth more than her father's yearly medical expenses slept in their racks. The air was cool and still, thick with the sacred smell of aging wine and sealed secrets. This was Moretti's true office, a soundproofed chamber where his public persona was shed and his real business was conducted. He and his three most trusted capos were seated around a massive oak table, the only light coming from a low-hanging lamp that cast their faces in harsh shadows. Alara moved silently in the periphery, her instructions to polish the silver humidors and dust the wine racks. She was, as always, meant to be invisible, a silent fixture in the room. On the table, unrolled with a dramatic flourish by Moretti, was a set of city blueprints, their crisp white paper, a stark contrast to the dark, oppressive atmosphere of the cellar. Moretti leaned over the schematics, his finger tracing a path through the intricate lines and symbols. His voice was a low, confident rumble, filled with the self-satisfaction of a master craftsman revealing his magnum opus. He spoke of a heist, a perfect operation targeting the vault of a downtown bank. He boasted of his meticulous planning, his inside sources, his understanding of the city's security systems. But his true pride was in the escape route. He pointed to a thin, dotted line on the blueprint. An abandoned utility tunnel, he explained, running directly beneath their target. He mocked the ignorant city officials, the overpaid bureaucrats who didn't know the secrets of their own infrastructure. He spoke with the unassailable arrogance of a man who believed his intellect was a force of nature, his plans infallible. Throughout his speech, he never once glanced toward Alara, who was meticulously polishing a silver humidor just a few feet away. Her presence was of no consequence to him. She was merely a pair of hands, deaf and dumb to the machinations of powerful men like himself. But Alara heard everything. And when Moretti's finger tapped the blueprint and he announced the specific designation of the tunnel, sub-level utility corridor 7B, a jolt went through her, cold and electric. Her hand froze, the polishing cloth still against the cool silver. The world around her seemed to slow down, the low hum of the cellar's climate control fading into a dull roar in her ears. Sub-level utility corridor 7B. It wasn't just a name to her. It was the subject of her graduate thesis. She had spent over a year in the city archives, poring over century-old schematics and modern engineering reports, documenting the life, death, and rebirth of that exact section of the city's underground. Her mind, a flawless archive of structural data, instantly retrieved the file, a 2018 municipal project, the foundation work for the new Metro Line's central hub. She could see the engineering report in her mind's eye, the cross-sections showing tons of reinforced concrete poured to stabilize the ground. The image of her father, frail and voiceless in his hospital bed, flashed through her mind, and a cold, clarifying anger solidified in her veins. The same blind arrogance that had destroyed her family was now on full display, planning another act of ruin. A reverent silence followed Moretti's speech. His capos stared at the blueprint, their expressions a mixture of awe and greed. They were believers, disciples at the feet of their architect. Moretti leaned back in his chair, a smug smile playing on his lips, basking in the glow of his own perceived genius. He was a king in his court, his word as infallible as scripture. The silence stretched, thick and heavy in the cool air of the cellar. It was a silence of absolute deference. And then, it was broken. From the shadows in the corner of the room, a voice spoke, calm, clear, and steady. Ilara did not raise her voice. She did not turn around. She simply spoke to the wine rack she was supposed to be cleaning. That tunnel was filled with reinforced concrete and sealed in 2018 for the new Metro Line's foundation. It's a tomb. A profound stillness descended upon the room, heavier than before. She slowly placed her cloth down, turned, and for the first time, met Don Vincent Moretti's gaze directly. Her eyes were not defiant, not fearful, but filled with an unshakable certainty. "Your entry point is sound," she added, her voice cutting through the silence like a surgeon's scalpel. "But your exit is a trap." The silence that fell on the cellar was not empty. It was a dense, heavy substance that seemed to suck the very air from the room, pressing down on the shoulders of the men around the table. The smell of aged wine and expensive cigar smoke suddenly seemed stale, cloying. For a long, stretched moment, the only sound was the faint, electric hum of the climate control unit, a sound no one had noticed until all others had ceased. The three capos, men whose faces were hard-carved masks of loyalty and intimidation, were frozen in place. Their eyes, which moments before had been filled with a greedy reverence for their boss, now darted nervously between the imposing figure of Don Moretti and the small, still form of the cleaning woman in the corner. Their confidence, so absolute a minute ago, had been punctured, and a slow leak of uncertainty was beginning to hiss into the atmosphere of the hallowed room. They were looking at their infallible leader, the man they called the architect, and for the first time, they were seeing a crack in his foundation. The blueprint on the table, once a sacred text of their impending victory, now looked like a child's drawing, a fantasy rendered meaningless by a single, quiet sentence from the shadows. Don Vincent Moretti did not move. His body remained perfectly still, a sculpture of tailored silk and controlled power, but inside his mind, a tectonic shift was occurring. The initial shock, the sheer cognitive dissonance of a piece of furniture speaking out of turn, was rapidly being consumed by a wave of pure, unadulterated narcissistic rage. It was a fury so profound it was almost silent, a white-hot burn that started in his gut and spread through his veins. He had been contradicted. He had been corrected. He, the man who moved skyscrapers and reshaped skylines with a phone call, had been made to look like a fool. And by whom? By a nobody. A woman in a cheap uniform, whose name he did not know and would never care to learn. Her existence had been, until that very moment, a complete and utter irrelevance. For her to possess knowledge he did not, for her to wield it in front of his most trusted men, was not merely an insult, it was a violation of the natural order of his universe. The cold slate of his eyes hardened, the faint, charming crinkles at their corners vanishing, replaced by a flat, murderous stillness. Ilara felt the shift in the room's energy, the sudden focus of four powerful men directed at her like the lens of a microscope. Yet she felt no fear. The terror that had lived in her gut for years, the constant, low-grade anxiety about her father's health and their precarious finances, had been cauterized by the cold, clean flame of her purpose. As she stood there, her back still mostly to them, her mind was a sanctuary of calm. The image of her father, not as he was now, but as he had been, his face lit with pride as he watched her sketch her first building, filled her consciousness. That memory was her armor. The arrogance she had just witnessed from Moretti was not just the pride of a crime boss, It was the same soul-crushing hubris that had left her father a broken man in a sterile white room. The two events, separated by years, were now fused into a single defining moment. She was no longer just a daughter grieving a stolen past. She was an architect who had just identified a fatal structural flaw in the man who had caused it all. Her breath was even, her hands steady. She was finally standing on solid ground. Moretti's voice, when it finally came, was a low and dangerous purr, a predator attempting to reassert its dominance through sheer intimidation. He did not raise his voice. He leaned forward slightly, placing his manicured hands flat on the blueprint, as if to reclaim its authority. He addressed the air in front of him, refusing to grant her the dignity of a direct gaze. "And what?" he began, the words dripping with a thick, syrupy contempt. "Would a woman who scrubs floors for a living possibly know about municipal engineering?" He let the question hang in the air, a weapon designed to humiliate, to shrink her back into the nothingness from which she had emerged. It was a test for his men, a command for them to realign their loyalties, to remember who held the power. One of the capos, a thick-necked man named Rico, let out a short, nervous chuckle, a pathetic attempt to follow his boss's lead and restore the room's proper hierarchy. The sound died almost instantly in the oppressive silence. Alara finally turned her entire body to face them. She moved, not with the hurried motion of a servant, but with the deliberate grace of an expert taking the stage. Her eyes, clear and unwavering, met Moretti's. There was no anger in them, only the dispassionate certainty of a fact. She did not bother to answer his question directly. She simply presented the evidence, her voice as calm and precise as a laser level. The project was designated Municipal Upgrade 44B, commissioned by the Metropolitan Transit Authority to stabilize the substrate for the new Central Line hub. The lead engineer of record was Arthur Geller. The final structural report, documenting the C-40/50th grade reinforced concrete pour, was filed with the city clerk on October 17, 2018. Each detail was a hammer blow, dismantling his authority piece by piece. She paused, letting the weight of her knowledge settle in the room. "The tunnel isn't empty," she concluded, her voice dropping slightly. "It's 5 meters of solid rock. A dead end." The effect of her words was catastrophic. The feigned confidence on the faces of Moretti's men dissolved completely, replaced by a stark, naked fear. Their heist was not just flawed. It was a suicide mission. They would have been trapped like rats in a concrete box, waiting for the authorities to come and collect them. Their gazes shifted to Moretti, no longer seeking reassurance but answers. They saw the truth in the woman's calm demeanor and the undeniable specificity of her claims. And in that moment, their faith in the architect, the foundation of his entire operation, crumbled into dust. They were seeing him not as a genius, but as a reckless amateur who had almost led them to their doom. The power dynamic in the room had been irrevocably shattered. A cleaning woman, with nothing more than her memory, had stripped the king of his crown in front of his entire court, revealing him to be not just fallible, but a fraud. Moretti's face, which had been a mask of controlled menace, finally broke. A dark, ugly flush crept up his neck, staining his cheeks a mottled red. The veins on his temples pulsed visibly. The charm, the old-world sophistication, the entire carefully constructed persona of the legitimate businessman evaporated like mist in a harsh sun, revealing the raw, brutish thug beneath. His lips peeled back from his teeth in a silent snarl. It was the face of a man who had been so profoundly humiliated that his only recourse was violence, a primal rage that demanded an outlet. He couldn't attack her knowledge, so he would attack her existence. He slammed his fist down on the oak table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the confined space, making his own men flinch. The priceless wine bottles in their racks seemed to tremble from the force of his fury. "Get her out!" he roared, the sound ripping through the cellar, raw and uncontrolled. He was pointing a trembling finger at Ilara, his face a mask of pure hatred. He didn't even look at her anymore. He looked past her, at the door, as if the sight of her was physically painful to him. "Get this filth out of my sight, now!" His voice cracked on the last word, a testament to the depth of his fury. He turned his venomous gaze on the restaurant manager, who had been summoned by the commotion and was now hovering nervously at the cellar entrance, his face pale with terror. "She's fired, you hear me? If I ever see her face again, in this building or on this street, I will burn this place to the ground with you inside it." The threat was not an exaggeration, it was a promise, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who had the power to make it a reality. The manager, a man named Mr. Dubois, who normally glided through his restaurant with an air of unshakable authority, scurried forward, his composure completely gone. He grabbed Ilara's arm with a sweaty, trembling hand, his own fear making his grip painfully tight. "Come with me now," he hissed, his voice a panicked whisper. He began to pull her from the room, treating her not as an employee but as a piece of hazardous material that needed to be disposed of immediately. Ilara did not resist. She allowed herself to be manhandled, her body moving with a strange, fluid calm. As she was dragged past the table, she allowed her gaze to lock with Moretti's one last time. There was no triumph in her eyes, no fear, only a quiet, profound knowing. It was a look that said, "You do not know who I am, but you will." Moretti met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw a promise of his own, a promise of retribution. He could not tolerate a witness to his humiliation. He could not allow someone who had made him look weak to simply walk away into the night. She was unceremoniously shoved out of the restaurant's back service entrance, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind her with a deafening clang of finality. The cool, damp air of the alley hit her, smelling of garbage and stale cooking oil, a stark contrast to the perfumed opulence she had just left. Her uniform, once a symbol of her invisibility, now felt like a costume from a play that had just ended in disaster. The adrenaline that had sustained her in the cellar began to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. The reality of her situation crashed down upon her with the force of a physical blow. She was unemployed. The meager but steady income that paid for her father's care, the one thing that gave her a semblance of control over their shattered lives, was gone. She had traded her family's lifeline for a single moment of defiant truth. Standing alone in the dimly lit alley, the weight of that choice felt immense, suffocating. Her journey home was a blur of lonely streetlights and the rhythmic sound of her own footsteps on the cracked pavement. The city at this hour was a different creature, quiet and desolate, its glittering facade stripped away to reveal the concrete and steel bones beneath. It was a landscape she understood intimately, yet tonight she felt like a stranger in it. Each passing building seemed to mock her, a monument to the career she had lost, the life that had been stolen. She walked through the sleeping streets, the architect of her own ruin, her mind a maelstrom of fear and regret. What had she been thinking? What good was a moment of pride when her father was lying in a hospital bed, dependent on her for his very survival? The image of his frail body, the quiet beep of the machines that kept him stable, flooded her mind, and a wave of nausea and panic washed over her. Tears of frustration and terror welled in her eyes, blurring the city lights into abstract streaks of color. She finally reached the door to her small, third-floor walk-up apartment, her hands fumbling with the keys. The space was cramped, filled with the ghosts of a better time. Books on structural engineering and architectural history were stacked in every corner, silent testaments to a passion she could no longer afford to pursue. Her father's old drafting table, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust, stood against one wall like a forgotten altar. The air inside was still and smelled faintly of antiseptic and old paper, the scent of her current reality. She sank into a worn armchair, the springs groaning in protest, and let her head fall into her hands. The full weight of her decision pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. She had not just lost a job, she had failed her father, She had let her pride, her intellect, her anger get the best of her, and now they would both pay the price. A single, hot tear escaped her closed eyelids and traced a path down her cheek. It was in that moment of absolute despair, as she sat drowning in the silence of her apartment, that Moretti's words from the cellar echoed back to her. He had sneered at her, mocked her knowledge of the city, but he had also spoken of his other life, his public persona as a real estate magnate, a developer. He had boasted about his projects, about shaping the city's skyline. The name, Moretti, and the phrase, quote, development project, began to clang together in her mind like an alarm bell. A cold dread, sharper and more profound than her fear of unemployment, began to creep into her consciousness. It was a wild, improbable thought, a connection her mind was almost afraid to make, but it was there, a seed of horrifying suspicion that began to sprout with sickening speed. She lifted her head, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. With a sudden, convulsive movement, she shot out of the chair and scrambled towards the back of her closet. There, buried under old blankets and winter coats, was a single, dusty cardboard box. It was a time capsule of her family's destruction, filled with the legal documents and business files from her father's company. She hadn't opened it in years. The pain was too great. But now, she tore it open with trembling hands, the smell of decaying paper filling the small room. She frantically sifted through stacks of invoices, liens, and threatening letters from lawyers. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of dread and anticipation. She was looking for one thing, the master contract for the project that had destroyed everything, the luxury high-rise known as the Apex Tower. She found it at the bottom of the box, a thick sheaf of papers bound in a faded blue cover. Her breath caught in her throat as she flipped to the final signature page. The document was a relic of betrayal, its clauses filled with the legal jargon that had been used to ensnare her honest, trusting father. And there, at the bottom of the page, was the signature of the primary developer, the CEO of the parent company that had orchestrated the entire fraud. The name was written in a bold, arrogant script, a confident loop and flourish that was as much a statement of power as it was a signature. And as her eyes focused on the name, the world seemed to fall away. Vincent Moretti, CEO, Moretti Holdings. It was him. The man in the cellar. The man who had just fired her was not just some random crime boss. He was the architect of her family's ruin, the author of all her pain. In that instant, every ounce of fear, every shred of despair vanished from her body. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The chaotic storm of emotion inside her coalesced, compressed, and solidified into something new. It was not hatred, not even a desire for simple revenge. It was purpose, a purpose as clear and as solid as the concrete that filled Tunnel 7B. A cold, diamond-hard resolve settled deep within her soul. This was no longer about a lost job or a moment of defiance. This was about justice, a justice that had been denied for years. The man who saw her as invisible, as filth, was the very monster who had preyed on her family. And he had no idea who she was. He had no idea of the knowledge she held in her mind, the intricate map of his city, his history, his crimes, that she was now beginning to assemble. Her mind, the brilliant architectural mind that had been dormant for so long, whirred back to life. It began to work with a speed and clarity that startled her. A single contract was not enough. His lawyers would tear it apart, bury it in motions and delays. She needed more. She needed to prove a pattern of fraud, a history of corruption that was so extensive, so undeniable, that it would bring down his entire empire, both legitimate and criminal. She needed evidence, blueprints, permits, inspection reports, documents that were buried deep within the city's archives. She needed access. And as she thought of access, one name came to her mind, a beacon of hope in the darkness: Dr. Alistair Finch, her former professor and mentor at the university. The man who had called her a once-in-a-generation talent, who had been devastated when she'd been forced to drop out. He had retired from teaching and now served on the board of the City Historical Preservation Society, a position that gave him unparalleled access to the very archives she needed to raid. She found her old address book, her fingers tracing over the faded ink until they found his name and number. For a moment she hesitated. This was a dangerous path. Moretti was not a man to be trifled with. Contacting her professor would mean pulling him into her world, into her fight, and potentially putting him in harm's way. The risk was immense, but then the image of her father, silent and still in his hospital bed, rose in her mind once more. The risk of inaction was greater. The risk of letting Moretti continue to build his empire on the ruins of good people's lives was a price she was no longer willing to pay. With a steady hand, she picked up her phone. She dialed the number, each tone a declaration of intent. When a familiar, scholarly voice answered on the other end, Alistair Finch speaking, the voice that replied was not that of Alara Vance, the fired cleaning lady. It was the voice of an architect, a strategist, a woman who was about to design the complete and total demolition of Vincent Moretti's world. "Professor," she said, her voice calm and filled with an unshakable resolve, "it's Alara. I need your help. I've found him." The home of Professor Alistair Finch was a world away from the cold marble and colder stairs of La Centilla. It was a sanctuary of thought, a small, book-lined house on a quiet, tree-canopied street where the loudest sound was the gentle rustling of leaves. The air inside smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and lemon-scented wood polish, a comforting aroma that spoke of a life dedicated to knowledge and quiet contemplation. Finch himself, a man with a shock of unruly white hair and eyes that still held the sharp, inquisitive glint of a lifelong academic, opened the door with a look of profound surprise that quickly softened into concern. He ushered Alara in, his movements gentle, as if she were a rare artifact he was afraid of damaging. He remembered her not as a service worker, but as the most brilliant mind he had ever had the privilege to teach, a student whose designs had promised to reshape the very fabric of the city with both beauty and integrity. He led her to his study, a room where books were not merely decorations but the very walls of the space stacked from floor to ceiling, their spines a mosaic of history, theory, and engineering. He settled her into a worn leather armchair that seemed to embrace her and waited, his silence an invitation for her to share the burden she was so clearly carrying. Alara sat on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to still their trembling. For a moment, she was overwhelmed by the sheer kindness in the room, a stark contrast to the brutal indifference that had become her daily reality. In this space, surrounded by the tools of her lost passion, she felt the full weight of the years that had been stolen from her. She took a deep breath, the scent of old books grounding her, and she began to speak. Her voice, at first, was quiet, hesitant, as she recounted the story of her father's ruin, a narrative she had locked away for so long it felt like tearing open a wound to let it see the light. She spoke of the Apex Tower, of the fraudulent contracts, of the stroke that had silenced the strong, vibrant man she adored. Then, her voice gained strength, a cold, hard edge of precision creeping in as she detailed the events in the wine cellar, the blueprint, the arrogant confession, and the final, horrifying discovery of Vincent Moretti's name on her father's documents. She did not plead or weep. She presented her case with the methodical clarity of an architect, laying out a structural analysis, each fact a carefully placed load-bearing column in the edifice of her argument. Professor Finch listened without interruption, his expression shifting from scholarly curiosity to deep, paternal anger. He had followed the Apex Tower scandal in the papers years ago, had lamented it as another sad tale of corporate greed crushing the little man, but he had never known the personal cost, had never connected it to the sudden and tragic disappearance of his most promising student. As Alara spoke, he saw the ghost of the brilliant young woman from his classroom merge with the hardened, determined figure before him. He saw the fire of her intellect, a fire he had thought extinguished, now burning with a new and dangerous intensity. When she finished, a heavy silence settled in the study, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, each tick marking a second of stolen time. He rose from his desk, walked to the window, and stared out at the quiet street, his mind processing the enormity of what she had told him. He was a man of books and theories, of historical preservation and quiet debate. She was asking him to step out of the archives and into a war against a man who did not play by any rules. He turned back to her, his decision made. The duty of a teacher, he had always believed, was not just to impart knowledge, but to nurture the truth. And the truth, in this case, had been buried for far too long. Moretti has spent decades building a fortress of shell corporations, legal loopholes, and political favors. Finch said, his voice a low, serious rumble. A single contract, even with his signature, will be dismissed by his army of lawyers as an old business dispute. They will paint your father as incompetent, and you as a disgruntled, vindictive ex-employee. He paused, letting the harsh reality of their challenge settle. To bring him down, we can't just find a crack in his fortress. We need to find the faulty blueprint upon which the entire structure was built. We need to prove a systemic pattern of fraud, a career built on lies. And for that, he said, a determined glint in his eye, we will need to go to the heart of the city's memory, the municipal archives. He unlocked a drawer in his antique desk and removed a small, laminated card with his photograph on it. It was his all-access pass as a board member of the Preservation Society. He slid it across the polished wood to her. This will open the doors, he said. Your mind will have to do the rest. The Municipal Archives was a mausoleum of civic history, a vast, subterranean labyrinth beneath City Hall where the city's paper soul was laid to rest. The air was cool and dry, carrying the distinct, dusty scent of slowly decaying paper and binding glue. Fluorescent lights cast a sterile, humming glow over endless rows of towering metal shelves, each one packed with heavy, string-tied binders and cardboard boxes labeled with faded ink. The silence was absolute, a sacred hush broken only by the whisper of turning pages and the soft whir of the microfiche machine. For Ilara, stepping into this space was like coming home. The uniform of the cleaning lady was gone, replaced by the comfortable, anonymous clothes of a researcher. Here, she was not invisible because she was insignificant. She was invisible because she was consumed by her work. With Professor Finch's credentials clipped to her shirt, she moved through the silent aisles with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She was an architect once more, not designing new structures but excavating the foundations of old crimes, searching for the rot hidden deep within the concrete. Her initial days were a frustrating descent into a bureaucratic maze. Moretti was a master of obfuscation. His name appeared nowhere on the most critical documents. Instead, she found a dizzying web of limited liability corporations and holding companies, names like Keystone Development Group, Summit Properties, and Azure Real Estate Ventures, all legally distinct but all leading back to the same handful of law firms and accountants known to be on Moretti's payroll. She spent hours hunched over a microfiche reader, its green light illuminating blueprints and permits until her eyes burned, tracing the flow of money and approvals through a complex system designed to make a single individual unaccountable. She cross-referenced building permits with zoning variances, supply manifests with inspection reports, her eidetic memory, her only tool against the deliberate chaos of the paper trail. It felt like trying to map a river by chasing a single drop of water. For every promising lead she uncovered, it would vanish into another shell corporation, another legal dead end. The fortress Finch had spoken of seemed impenetrable. The weight of her task began to press down on her. Each night she would return to her small apartment, her mind reeling with names and numbers, the smell of old paper clinging to her clothes. She would sit by the phone, waiting for the nightly call from the nurse at her father's care facility, a brief clinical update that always ended the same way: no change. The financial pressure was mounting, her savings were dwindling, and the due date for the next month's payment for his care loomed like a guillotine. Doubt began to creep in, a cold, insidious whisper in the back of her mind. Was she chasing a ghost? Had Moretti built a structure so perfect, so corrupt, that it was truly invulnerable? She thought of his smug, arrogant face in the wine cellar, and a fresh wave of determination washed over her. Arrogance, she knew, always left a trace. It always assumed no one was smart enough or patient enough to look closely. She would be that person. She would look until she found it. Her breakthrough came not from a major contract or a financial statement, but from a series of mundane, low-level documents, foundation-pouring permits. These were the forms signed off on site, often in the mud and chaos of a construction zone, the last piece of bureaucratic oversight before tons of concrete were poured, literally sealing the evidence forever. As she compared the permits from 5 different Moretti-linked projects over a decade, including the Apex Tower, she noticed a single, consistent signature at the bottom of each one. It belonged to a mid-level city inspector named Gerald Poe. His signature was the common denominator, the one constant in a sea of changing corporate names and project managers. He was the gatekeeper, the man who had looked the other way, who had certified that the proper materials were in place when they were not. He was the first critical flaw she had found in Moretti's grand design. With a renewed sense of purpose, Ilara and Professor Finch began to build a profile of Gerald Poe. They dug through old city employee directories, property records, and even archived social pages from local newspapers. A picture began to emerge of a man living well beyond the means of a public servant. They found records of a luxury boat purchased in cash, 2 European vacations a year, and a suburban home whose mortgage was paid off in a startlingly short amount of time. Then they found the key detail. Poe had taken an early retirement just 3 months after the Apex Tower investigation was officially closed, citing, quote, health reasons. His digital footprint, his very existence, seemed to vanish after that date. There were no new property records, no credit history, no social media presence. He had become a ghost, paid handsomely for his silence, and then erased from the board. He was their star witness, and he was gone. The disappointment was a physical blow. The trail had gone cold, and with it, a significant portion of their hope. Ilara sat in the archive, staring at a grainy photo of Poe from a 20-year-old city newsletter, his face a bland mask of mediocrity. He was the key, and he was untouchable. She felt the walls closing in again, the ticking clock of her father's medical bills growing louder in her ears. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes, and for a moment she let her mind drift away from the paperwork. She stopped thinking like a detective searching for a person and started thinking like an architect analyzing a system. The fraud wasn't just about a person signing a form. The fraud was physical. It was in the rebar, the concrete, the very earth beneath the buildings. The evidence wasn't just in these boxes. It was embedded in the city's skyline. A new idea began to form in her mind, a daring shift in strategy. If she couldn't prove the crime through the paperwork alone, she would use the paperwork to prove the crime in the structures themselves. She returned to the blueprints, but this time she wasn't looking for signatures. She was looking for a specific type of architectural and engineering deceit. She pulled the geological surveys for all of Moretti's major developments. A stunning pattern emerged. He consistently acquired land that was considered undesirable for major construction due to soil instability or high water tables, parcels he could purchase for a fraction of their potential value. His genius wasn't in building, but in manipulating the system to make impossible projects seem viable. The official engineering reports he filed were masterpieces of fiction, specifying complex and costly foundation systems, like deep-driven steel piles and extensive soil stabilization, necessary to make the structures safe on such compromised ground. Then, she began the painstaking process of cross-referencing these grand plans with the mundane reality of supply chain manifests from the subcontractors. It was a needle in a haystack search, digging through the archives of trucking companies and material suppliers, but her persistence paid off. She found them. Invoices and bills of lading that showed the materials actually delivered to the construction sites were a fraction of what was specified in the official plans. Instead of deep steel piles, they had delivered cheap, shallow concrete footings. Instead of high-grade reinforced concrete, they had delivered the bare minimum standard. It was the apex tower fraud, repeated over and over again, a business model built on endangering lives for profit. He wasn't just a cheat. He was building monuments to his own greed that were, at their core, ticking time bombs. Her focus narrowed to one building in particular, the Viridian, a gleaming 40-story luxury condominium on the west side, completed 5 years ago. It was one of Moretti's flagship legitimate projects, but Alara found a trail of public complaints and civil suits against the building's management company, another Moretti shell corporation, related to persistent leaks, cracked walls, and unsettling vibrations in the lower floors. The residents knew their building was sick, but they didn't know the true nature of the disease. They were her validators, the living proof of his crimes. But she needed more than anecdotal evidence. She needed irrefutable scientific proof that the building's foundation was not what Moretti claimed it to be. Getting access to the building's structural core was impossible, a direct assault on his fortress. But then her architectural memory, her greatest gift, provided her with an unexpected key. She remembered a detail from her university studies, a lecture on urban development and historical preservation. The Viridian had been a controversial project because it was built directly adjacent to the old mercantile exchange, a protected historical landmark. She recalled the public outcry, the concessions the developer had to make. One of those concessions, mandated by the City Historical Preservation Society, was that the landmark building had to be fitted with seismic monitors throughout the Viridian's construction to ensure the foundation work did not damage the older structure. Those monitoring reports, filled with precise, scientific data about every vibration, every hammer blow, every subterranean shift from the adjacent construction site, would have been filed with the Preservation Society. They would be in Professor Finch's domain. They were the building's secret diary, an impartial witness that had recorded the truth of its construction second by second. Professor Finch, using his authority on the board, retrieved the files from the Society's private archives within a day. They were not simple documents, but thick binders filled with pages of raw seismographic data, endless squiggly lines and columns of numbers that would be meaningless to a layman. But to Alara, they were a language she understood perfectly. She spread the reports across the floor of her small apartment, the pages forming a vast, complex map of the past. For 2 days, she barely ate or slept, her mind a supercomputer processing the data. She calculated the vibrational frequencies, the displacement waves, the duration of the subterranean work. And then she found it. The seismic signature of the pile drivers used during the Viridian's foundation phase did not match the deep earth resonance of steel piles being driven 50 meters into bedrock, as specified in Moretti's engineering reports. Instead, the data was a perfect match for the shallow, rapid-fire vibrations of pouring simple concrete footings no more than 10 meters deep. It was there, hidden in the silent language of waves and numbers. It was the smoking gun. While Alara was making her discovery, the subject of her investigation was beginning to feel the pressure of an unseen enemy. Don Vincent Moretti, a man who prided himself on knowing everything that happened in his city, was growing paranoid. A routine audit he had initiated to find a leak in his criminal enterprise had unexpectedly turned up red flags in his legitimate businesses. Inquiries from financial regulators prompted by anonymous tips were becoming more frequent. He felt a subtle shift in the balance of power, a tightening in the air. He couldn't pinpoint the source, but he knew he was being hunted. He moved through his opulent world with a new, cold vigilance, ordering his most trusted men to begin shredding decades of documents, moving assets to offshore accounts, and sanitizing their digital histories. His arrogance was being eroded by a primal, reptilian fear of the unknown. He was a predator who had suddenly realized that he too could become prey. It was Professor Finch who brought her the final piece of the puzzle. He arrived at her apartment one evening holding a copy of the city's most prestigious business journal. On the cover was a smiling, confident photograph of Vincent Moretti. The headline read, "Urban Visionary Vincent Moretti to receive City Hall's Pinnacle Award for contributions to urban renewal." The gala was in 1 week. It was the height of his public legitimacy, the ultimate monument to his fraudulent success. The irony was so profound it was almost poetic. He was being celebrated for the very crimes that had built his empire. For Ilara, the news was not an insult, it was an invitation. It was the perfect stage, a room filled with the city's most powerful figures, journalists and politicians, all gathered to pay tribute to a monster. It was a stage Moretti had built for himself, and she would use it to host his public execution. She spent the next few days not in the archives, but at her father's old drafting table, the one she hadn't touched in years. She carefully wiped away the dust, the scent of old wood and graphite, a comforting ghost from her past. With the precision of a master architect, she began to assemble her case. She condensed the mountains of data, the blueprints, the supply manifests, and the seismic reports into a single, devastatingly clear document. It was a 2-page summary, an executive report on the life and crimes of Vincent Moretti, written in the cold, irrefutable language of science and engineering. It was a structural analysis of a man's corruption, and it proved beyond any doubt that his entire empire was built on a foundation of lies. She made copies, her movements calm and deliberate. The plan was no longer about revenge for the heist or the job she had lost. It was about tearing down a rotten structure to its very foundations so that something new and something true could be built in its place. On the evening of the gala, she stood before the small, cracked mirror in her apartment. She was not dressed in a cleaning uniform or the anonymous clothes of a researcher. She wore a simple, elegant dark dress, a gift from Professor Finch, who insisted that she look not like a victim, but like the professional she was. She held the report in her hand, the paper cool and solid against her skin. She looked at her own reflection, and for the first time in a long time, she saw not the ghost of a failed student, or the tired caregiver of a broken man. She saw Ilara Vance, an architect. She was not going to a party to confront a mob boss. She was going to a public hearing to present her findings. And the structure she was about to condemn was the life of Vincent Moretti. Her heart was not pounding with fear, but beating with a slow, steady rhythm of purpose. The stage was set, the audience was waiting, and the architect of justice was ready to unveil her masterpiece. The City Hall Rotunda was a cathedral of power, a soaring dome of marble and gold leaf that seemed to amplify every sound into an echo of importance. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and catered hors d'oeuvre, vibrated with the murmur of 100 conversations, a symphony of political maneuvering and social posturing underscored by the delicate clinking of champagne flutes. Light from colossal chandeliers bathed the scene in a warm, forgiving glow, glinting off of polished metals, silk lapels, and the flash of camera bulbs from the press corps corralled behind a velvet rope. It was a world designed to project an image of civic virtue and unassailable success, a carefully constructed stage for the city's elite. Ilara moved through this opulent crowd not as a ghost, but as a shadow with a purpose. Her simple dark dress allowed her to blend in, yet her posture, erect and unwavering, set her apart. Her heart beat with a slow, steady cadence, a metronome of resolve. She was not intimidated by the wealth or the power that surrounded her. She saw only the intricate framework of a corrupt system, and she was here to expose the fatal flaw in its keystone. Every condescending glance she had ever endured, every sleepless night spent worrying about her father, every moment of despair in her cramped apartment had been forged into the quiet, unshakable confidence she now carried like a concealed weapon. She was a force of structural integrity in a room built on lies. and she knew that the entire edifice was about to come crashing down. Vincent Moretti was in his element, the absolute center of this gilded universe. He stood near the grand staircase, accepting congratulations with the practiced grace of a monarch, his smile a masterpiece of false humility. His tailored tuxedo fit him like a second skin, a uniform of legitimacy that masked the rot beneath. He was surrounded by the city's most influential figures, the mayor, council members, fellow developers, all of them orbiting him like planets around a sun, drawn in by the gravity of his wealth and power. To them, he was not a criminal. He was a visionary, a benefactor, the man who had reshaped their skyline. As he laughed at a joke from the police commissioner, his gold signet ring catching the light, Ilara felt a profound and chilling clarity. This was his true crime. Not just the fraud, not just the ruined lives, but the masterful illusion he had created, convincing the very people meant to uphold the law that he was a pillar of their society. The image of her father, his hands once so strong and capable now lying still on a white hospital sheet, flashed in her mind, and the last vestiges of hesitation were burned away by a cold, righteous fury. She was not just seeking justice for one man, she was seeking it for every person whose life had been casually destroyed, to pave the way for this triumphant moment of deceit. The master of ceremonies approached a podium, tapping a microphone that sent a soft thud echoing through the rotunda, drawing the scattered conversations to a respectful hush. The time had come. Moretti, basking in the applause that rippled through the room, gave a final, charming nod to the mayor and began his short, confident walk toward the stage to accept his pinnacle award. His path was a clear channel through the sea of admirers, a red carpet of deference laid out before him. It was then that Ilara moved. She did not rush. She did not shout. She simply stepped out from behind a marble column and into his path, her movement so calm and deliberate that it seemed almost preordained. She positioned herself directly between Moretti and the podium, a single, quiet obstacle in his inexorable march to glory. He stopped, his practiced smile faltering for a fraction of a second, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes at this unknown woman who had dared to interrupt his coronation. He did not recognize her. To him, she was just another face in the crowd, a momentary inconvenience to be dismissed with a cold stare. He opened his mouth to have one of his men remove her, but she spoke first, her voice not loud, but clear and resonant, cutting through the expectant silence of the grand hall. "Mr. Moretti," she said, her tone level and professional, as if she were an engineer presenting a report. "My name is Ilara Vance." She held up a single, two-page document, the paper crisp and white, against the backdrop of her dark dress. "My father was Arthur Vance, of Vance Construction, the lead contractor on your Apex Tower project." A subtle shift occurred in Moretti's eyes, a dawning of a dark, buried memory, but it was already too late. The press, sensing a story, surged against the velvet rope, their cameras flashing, their microphones straining to catch her words. Ilara ignored them, her focus entirely on the man before her. "You are being honored tonight for your contributions to urban renewal. I am here to offer a correction to the public record." Her voice remained calm, but it carried the weight of years of suppressed truth. "This document is a comparative analysis. On the left, the engineering specifications for the Apex Towers Foundation, as filed with the city, signed by you, mandating grade 5 steel pylons driven to bedrock. On the right, a summary of the supply manifests from your subcontractors, proving the delivery of substandard, low-grade concrete footings." She paused, letting the words sink in, a quiet indictment that was more powerful than any scream. The murmur in the crowd grew, a wave of confusion and shock. The mayor, standing just feet away, took an involuntary step back, his face a mask of disbelief. Moretti's face, which had been a carefully constructed mask of public charm, began to crumble. The blood drained from it, leaving behind a waxy, pale sheen under the warm lights of the chandeliers. His eyes, those cold slate instruments of power, darted from Ilara to the document she held, then to the faces in the crowd, seeking an ally, an escape route, but finding only a sea of stunned, accusatory stares. The illusion was shattering in real time, the carefully crafted persona of the legitimate businessman dissolving to reveal the cornered predator beneath. "This is preposterous," he stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper that lacked all of its usual authority. But Alara was not finished. She took a step closer, her voice never wavering, a surgeon making the final, precise incision. This pattern of structural fraud was not an isolated incident. The seismic monitoring data from the construction of your Viridian Tower, cross-referenced with geological surveys, proves the same discrepancy. You have built an empire of glittering facades on foundations of sand and deceit, endangering the lives of thousands of residents for profit. She lowered the paper, her gaze locking with his. "You are not an architect of renewal, Mr. Moretti. You are an architect of ruin." The final word hung in the air, an irrefutable verdict delivered in the court of public opinion. The collapse was instantaneous and total. The rotunda, moments before a theater of celebration, became a scene of chaos. The flashes from the cameras were now a relentless, blinding strobe, capturing every nuance of Moretti's disintegration. His face contorted in a mask of pure, impotent rage, the veins in his neck standing out like cords. He lunged forward, not at Alara, but as if to flee, to escape the suffocating weight of the truth she had just unleashed. But there was nowhere to go. Uniformed officers, who had been part of the event's security detail, were already moving through the crowd, their expressions grim, their path cleared by the recoiling guests. The police commissioner, whose hand Moretti had been shaking just minutes earlier, now refused to meet his gaze, instead giving a sharp, definitive nod to his men. The cold, metallic click of handcuffs being snapped onto Moretti's wrists echoed through the cavernous space, a sound of finality that cut through the cacophony of shouts and questions from the press. The Pinnacle Award, a heavy, gilded sculpture of a skyscraper, sat alone and forgotten on the podium, a monument to a lie. As he was led away, his expensive tuxedo suddenly looking like a cheap costume, his eyes found Alara's one last time. In them she saw not hatred, but the hollow, vacant look of a man whose entire world had been demolished, a man who finally understood the fatal consequences of underestimating the invisible. Type, Justice, in the comments if you got chills when Alara finally exposed the truth. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal and social demolition. Alara's calm, devastating presentation at the gala acted as the detonator for a charge that had been waiting to blow for decades. Her meticulously prepared report, handed over to the district attorney that night, became the cornerstone of a massive federal RICO investigation into Moretti Holdings and its web of associated criminal enterprises. The media frenzy was relentless. Stories of other victims, emboldened by Alara's courage, began to surface. Other small business owners, union workers, and tenants who had been crushed by the Moretti machine. The gleaming towers he had built across the city were no longer seen as symbols of progress, but as monuments to his greed, each one subjected to intense structural scrutiny that confirmed Alara's findings. His empire, both legitimate and criminal, which had seemed as solid as granite, crumbled like the cheap concrete he had used to build it. Vincent Moretti, the architect, was buried under the ruins of his own creation, his name becoming a permanent synonym for corruption, his legacy forever erased. For Alara, the aftermath was a quiet, steady sunrise after a long and brutal night. The story of the invisible woman who brought down a kingpin captivated the city, but she shied away from the spotlight, refusing the talk shows and book deals. Her victory was not for public consumption, it was deeply personal. The breakthrough came in the form of a letter, delivered by courier to her small apartment. It was from Sterling and Thorne, the city's most respected architectural firm, a company known for its unwavering commitment to integrity and innovative design, and a longtime rival to Moretti's cutthroat development style. They weren't offering her an entry-level position, they were offering her a role as a senior project analyst in their new Urban Integrity Division, a department created specifically to audit and reinforce the structural safety of older buildings across the city. The letter cited not her newfound fame, but her unparalleled analytical skill, intellectual rigor, and profound moral clarity. It was a recognition not of the woman who had exposed a crime, but of the brilliant architect she had always been. Walking into the offices of Sterling and Thorne for the first time felt like coming home. The space was filled with light, the air humming with creative energy and the scent of fresh blueprints. There were no hushed, fearful whispers, only the vibrant sound of collaboration and innovation. When she shook the hand of the firm's founding partner, a woman whose work Ilara had admired for years, she felt a sense of belonging that she thought she had lost forever. Her first paycheck was more than she had made in a year at the restaurant, and with it, she did the one thing that had driven her through all the darkness. She moved her father from the sterile, state-funded facility to a private, specialized care center, a place with sunlit gardens, compassionate staff, and the best neurological therapy available. While the doctors said he might never speak or walk again, for the first time in years, when she sat by his bed and held his hand, she saw a flicker of the old light return to his eyes. He could not say the words, but she knew he understood. She had not only saved him, she had restored the honor of his name. Her new life was not built on the ashes of her revenge, but on the solid foundation of justice she had painstakingly laid herself, using her gifts not just to design buildings, but to rebuild a life of dignity, starting with the one that mattered most. If Ilara's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.